Attorney, you've taken Dorian on as a client. Talk to me about where you all are and what the contemplation is.
Well, where we are, the suit's been filed. It's now in federal court here in St. Louis. We're pleased to do it, and we've gotten a lot of questions about why we would do it, but justice has not been served here. The criminal justice system has let Ferguson down, Mike Brown's family down, Dorian down, and America down. And so, not unlike the civil rights movement, we have resorted to civil rights litigation, civil litigation, to achieve justice at a time when the criminal justice system failed.
So what is your contention?
My contention is that Darren Wilson violated the civil rights of these gentlemen, violated the civil rights of Michael Brown, violated the civil rights of Dorian Johnson. Police officers can't stop black kids for no reason, shoot them for no reason, chase them down and gun them down in the street. They just can't do that. And we have to take a stand, and here's the stand. What
do you tell critics who will say, and they will be out there, that will say to you that this is not an altruistic move, this is not a move to make America live up to its promise, this is simply a money grab?
Yeah, I think any legal pundit that looks at this will know that this is not about money. This is not a life-changing case in terms of monetary value. This is Dorian Johnson having the courage to take a stand. This is Dorian Johnson having the courage to go in federal court and say, let's take Darren Wilson's deposition. No one's done that yet. Let's get the evidence and let the public see it. No one's done that yet. This is not about money. The harm to this gentleman's life, Dorian Johnson, and the Michael Brown family can't be replaced with money. You can't put a dollar amount on that.
How atypical is it that the deposition would not have been taken of this police officer?
You know, I think it's a function of the process not being played out. It's a function of the criminal justice system not letting this case play itself out in a natural fashion. And that's why we don't have more from Darren Wilson, but hopefully we'll get it in this civil suit.
You know, and something you'll have to address, I'm sure, the DOJ's findings suggest that the story that your client tells does not jive with ballistics and the investigation of what police or law enforcement, I should say, found.
I'm glad you asked that, because the Department of Justice report, I think, is misunderstood. First of all, the Department of Justice, just by the function of what it is, it's part of the police system. It's part of the overall system that is treating black citizens in this country unfairly. The Department of Justice didn't start when Eric Holder became the Attorney General. It didn't start when Barack Obama became president. They are enforcing laws and procedures that have been in place for a long time that have treated black citizens in this country unfairly.
So the inference there is, though, that because you had two black men as the head of that there may have been some wink and nods that occurred prior to that. One may say, though, that because you had two black males at the helm when this occurred, that there were no winks and no nods.
Well, I think although you had two black males at the helm, Eric Holder wasn't out there conducting witness interviews. Barack Obama wasn't gathering evidence. Eric Holder didn't have the tape measure out measuring blood spatter. What they did was they reviewed information that came to them at a very high level after investigation by St. Louis County police officers, and then eventually some members of the FBI. But if you look at the Department of Justice's report, which I have here on the screen, it talks about first interview with St. Louis County, then interview with investigators, then grand jury testimony. There are so many different witness accounts in this case. Take witness 115, who says Wilson got out of his SUV, gun drawn, and immediately fired shots as he began to walk quickly in Brown's direction. That's contrary to what Darren Wilson said. No one's picking up on that. Witness 123, who was in the car that Dorian Johnson hid behind, said, I watched through the back window as Brown turned around with his hands halfway up shoulder height and then crunched as he was about to go to the ground, then heard a volley of shots, and Brown fell forward to his death.
Yet discrepancies with a number of witnesses, as you know, is not an atypical occurrence, particularly in stressful moments like this. Correct?
Correct.
So this says what, though? I mean, you throw that out to say what?
This says there are witnesses who support Dorian Johnson's version of events. There are witnesses who support Darren Wilson's version of events. In the normal legal system, you take that to a jury. And I get to present my evidence, and I said, look at all these witnesses who say one thing. And then Darren Wilson and his folk get to go up and say, look at these witnesses, they show another. But the grand jury and then the Department of Justice cut us off. It's as if they never wanted us to test that evidence. See, the reason why they call a trial is because you're testing the evidence. I want to test those witnesses. I want to test the supposed scientists who have a theory about why the blood was 20 feet from Darren Wilson. None of that's happened.
So is this a test also of the grand jury system, which came under a lot of scrutiny in Ferguson? And if that is the case, this becomes a much bigger apple than anything that we're talking about simply at the death of Mike Brown.
No question. It is hopefully the point at which hopefully we can use this civil litigation and what happened here in Ferguson. This is the point where it stops, where we say we can indict a police officer for murdering somebody black, even if it's not captured on video. It cannot be a coincidence that no conviction in Trayvon Martin, no indictment here.
No, but it was not a police officer, we should note.
Very true. But a situation where an unarmed black kid was killed unnecessarily, nonetheless, and someone got away with it. So we have to get to a point where we don't have to have it on video in order to hold officers or other people accountable for killing young black males. And this is what we're seeing here, despite all the evidence, despite the very credible, you talked to Dorian Johnson, despite the very credible opinion and testimony and observations of Dorian Johnson and all the other witnesses who corroborate exactly what he said. Somehow, someone makes a determination that we're not going to recognize those witnesses who are against what we say, and we're going to give this police officer a pass. That has to stop. And then thankfully it's stopping in Cincinnati. Thankfully it stopped in Baltimore. But we had video in those cases. Let's do it here where there is no video, but the evidence is overwhelming.
So when you talk about credible is a subjective word. There will be those that will suggest that perhaps we don't have as much credible corroboration or eyewitness information as one would like. What do you want this to change across the board?
Here's what I'd like to change, that the decision makers start to put themselves in the shoes of black America. I try cases all over the country, and I tell juries there's a lot of different ways to assess credibility, but the most important way is to ask yourself, what makes sense? Does the story they're telling you make sense? Does the narrative make sense? It does not make sense that Mike Brown and Dorian Johnson would get shot at a police car, run down the street, stop for no reason, turn around, and then start charging toward the very guy that had just been shooting at them. That doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense that Mike Brown of his size and stature and Darren Wilson of his size and stature would, as Darren Wilson say, lean his entire body inside of an SUV, waist, torso, and all, to try to do what? Inside a window that's this big? It doesn't make sense that these guys who have been dealing with police, like every other black person in America, been dealing with police and police overbearing in certain instances all their lives, to act this way. It's not a narrative that makes sense to anybody in the inner city, poor black communities. Maybe it makes sense to someone who doesn't have to deal with the police on this level. And so what I'd like to see come out of this is where people evaluate situations like this from the perspective of the victims.
Let me take you back to the DOJ report. It seems to me, I don't want to put words in your mouth, that there is an inference of perhaps either poor or shoddy investigation or deliberate investigation that did not take into account all of what was shown or at least overlooked purposely. Which do you believe it was?
As far as the Department of Justice report, I believe neither. I believe they took the easy way out. I believe that—
And just accepted what was given.
Or took the path of least resistance, given not just the evidence in the case, but what was happening all around, the riots, the social unrest, et cetera. And they had already uncovered an atrocious pattern of racist behavior by the Ferguson Police Department. This was the day that racism took a holiday? I mean, how can that be?
But they noted that. Let's be fair. They noted that. They, within the findings, suggested that there was rampant racism within that department.
That was undeniable. Unlike this shooting where there are different witnesses here and there, the statistics of the Ferguson Police Department almost exclusively targeting poor black people was undeniable.
So let's be clear on what you call the path of least resistance. What are you saying that is specifically?
That the grand jury had already, that Mr. McCullough and his folk had already set up the grand jury, the prosecutor, where there would not be an indictment. There had already been unrest about that situation. The St. Louis County investigators had already gotten started with the investigation before the federal government hit the ground.
But don't you believe had there been something egregious in the findings that were given to the DOJ, and one has to believe that ordinarily Attorney General Holder might not have combed through everything, every report that crossed his desk, one has to believe he certainly combed through this one.
Again, you'd have to ask Attorney General Holder, but here's what I do think.
You don't believe that?
I can't speak to that.
You have a point of view.
My point of view, if Eric Holder had conducted this entire investigation start to finish, not knowing the man, not knowing anything about him, but from what I know of him from a distance, I don't know how it would have played out. Because again, the Department of Justice is part of the police system, and they are enforcing laws and rules and case law that were in existence long before Eric Holder became Attorney General.
All right, let's play it out politically, and then I'll let it go. Let's play it out politically, though. Yes, you don't know him personally. You don't know what's in his heart. But just a good political play, a good political move would be, in a case that is receiving so much scrutiny, is to make sure that you would at least comb through that. Do you believe, even politically, that would be the thing to do?
And again, I'm not trying to avoid your question. Perhaps he did comb through it. If he did comb through it, there should have been a different result. I'd like to think, as an optimist, that maybe he didn't comb through it and he received high-level briefing and approved the report. But what I do think is this. You said a moment earlier that if there was something egregious, then there would have been action. We've got to get to a point in this country where it doesn't have to be oh so overwhelming and oh so egregious that we don't run to protect the rights of all citizens, including black citizens. There was enough evidence here. You have the only eyewitness who saw this thing start to finish saying he saw Darren Wilson shoot him in the back. You've got witness after witness after witness after witness saying they saw Darren Wilson shoot as he ran away. Not shoot in the back, because that's been a lot of source of controversy, but shoot as their backs were turned to him. You have witnesses in the Department of Justice report that say Michael Brown wasn't charging toward him. He was stumbling forward, having been shot. So we've got to get to a point in this country where, unless it's on video, streamed live for the whole world to see, egregious, without any way out, that we can still prosecute someone for infringing on the civil rights and murdering young black unarmed people.
So finally, best of all worlds for you. What would be the end result of whatever litigation you take?
The best of all worlds would be that we have a trial or an adjudication where someone looks at the evidence, where we are allowed to present, here are all the witnesses that support what Dorian Johnson said, because it's a big misconception that Dorian Johnson's on an island here and the Department of Justice is here. The Department of Justice report, all its 86 pages, half of it are witnesses who support what Dorian Johnson says, and yet the Department of Justice found one reason or another to say, well, we're not going to worry about that. I would prefer, and I would love to see, and I think America would love to see, a trial where all evidence is brought before a jury of the community's peers, and they can evaluate it for themselves. They don't have to take the Department of Justice's word for it. They don't have to take McCullough's word for it. They can make a determination the way this system is supposed to function.
And you would eliminate a grand jury process?
Oh, well, we're way past that. I mean, I would... No, I mean, a fairly conducted grand jury should have indicted. We say in law school you can indict a ham sandwich if you want to.
But there have been questions from time immemorial on whether or not you truly can ever get a fair grand jury.
The problem with the grand jury, there's no judge present. It's just the prosecutor, and he tells the grand jurors whatever he wants, including, we know in this case, where the prosecutors told the grand jury the wrong law about when a police officer can shoot. So that's my question. In best of all worlds for you, in your mind, is this a movement to eliminate or at least tweak the grand jury system as we know it? It would be a move to make it more transparent, because when you are the oppressed people, when you are the minority, then we need transparency. We can't say, oh, we trust you, you've got our back. We've seen that not happen time and time again. Let's put the witnesses and the evidence in front of the people and let them decide.
And what do you see? How do you see timeline, if you will? And I know I'm not holding you to a true timeline because you can never do that with the legal system, but give us a sense of how you see it playing out.
You know, traditional litigation, I think, takes about 1.5 to 2 years. This is anything but traditional, so we'll probably take somewhat longer with the discovery process. We just hope that we're able to get there. There have been so many things in this case that have stopped us along the way. Grand jury, prosecutors, police. We hope that the judges or the system don't cut us off before we can speak the truth. It's almost as if there's an effort to suppress the truth. In this shooting and so many other police shootings around the country, we just want an opportunity to put it all on the table. And why is there such an attempt to keep that from happening? I think that's because if we dig deep, we will know that justice was not done here, that things were covered up. And we are trying to shed light on it. And I applaud Dorian Johnson, who's a young man who is trying to better his life, and he has the courage to keep going with this fight to bring truth to light, even though there's some very powerful influences that are pushing against it.
The ghost of Mandela, hope my flow stays